Hey, welcome back, historians. Today I'm going to be talking about immigration in the North, agriculture in the South, and free Black people. Here's the guiding questions for you to think about. Here's the first one. What is the connection between European immigrants and African American slaves? Question number two is, how is that connection one reason for their woes in the United States? Be thinking of those two questions as you're listening to this video and working on your notes. So let's get started. Well, by the late 1840s, many factory workers in the North were immigrants. Now, an immigrant is someone who moves to a new country to live there permanently. Between the 1840s and 1850s, about 4 million immigrants came to the United States. Some of them were from Great Britain, hoping to earn better wages. At the time, there was a high demand for skilled workers like machinists, carpenters, and miners. One of the biggest immigrant groups came from Ireland. In the 1840s, a terrible disease wiped out Ireland's potato crops. Since potatoes were the main food source for poor Irish families, this caused a major crisis. Other crops like wheats and oats were still growing, but since Ireland was controlled by Britain, those crops were shipped to England instead of feeding the Irish people. As a result, Ireland suffered a famine, which is a severe shortage of food, where thousands of people starved to death. Between 1845 and 1860, over 1.5 million Irish people left Ireland and moved to the U.S. to escape hunger and poverty. Now, around the same time, many Germans were also coming to the U.S. Harsh weather in the late 1820s and early 1830s led to food shortages. By 1832, more than 10,000 Germans were arriving in America each year. Then, in 1848, revolutions broke out in Germany as people fought for more democratic rights. When the revolts failed, thousands of Germans had to flee their country. Others simply wanted a better life. Between 1848 and 1860, nearly 1 million Germans immigrated to the U.S. Many of them settled in cities like Boston, which is why the Boston Celtics, the basketball team, is named after the Irish Celts. African Americans and women still faced discrimination during this time. Not everyone welcomed the new immigrants. A group called the Nativists wanted to keep America for native-born white citizens. Their slogan was, "Americans must rule America," and they pushed for laws that made it harder for immigrants to come to the U.S. or vote. At the time, immigrants could become voters after living in the U.S. for 5 years, but nativists wanted to change that to 21 years. By the 1850s, hostility towards immigrants had grown so much that nativists created a political party to promote their beliefs. This party was strongly anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant, claiming that immigrants were stealing American jobs. The group was so secretive that when members were asked about it, they would reply, "I know nothing." Because of this, the group became known as the Know Nothing Party. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, the plantations in the South needed buyers in the North for the ever-growing population of their cotton. They also needed the manufactured goods that the northern factories were producing. In 1937, there was an 88-year-old woman named Katie Darling who shared what life was like growing up as an enslaved person in East Texas. And this is what she said, and I'm quoting what she wrote. She said, "Miss Stella, my young mistress, got all our ages down in a Bible. That is how I know I was born in 1849. My mother died in slavery and father ran away. By the time I was big enough to tote a cow pail, they put me to milking. Master had over 100 heads of cow, and most of the time me and Violet, who was another house girl, did all the milking. We were up before 5. By 5, we better be in that cow pen. We better milk all the cows too, or they'd bullwhip us." Katie, along with her brothers and sisters, worked from sunrise to sunset, even on Sundays. She was just one of the millions of African Americans across the South who endured the pain and suffering of slavery. When people picture the Old South, they often imagine massive plantations with hundreds of enslaved workers. These large estates did exist, but they were not the norm. In reality, most white Southerners were not wealthy plantation owners. In fact, most didn't own any slaves at all. A planter was someone who owned at least 20 slaves. By 1860, only one out of every 30 white Southerners came from a planter family. An even smaller group, less than 1%, owned more or 50, owned 50 or more slaves. These elite families, called the cottonocracy, made enormous amounts of money from growing and selling cotton. Even though they were few in number, their wealth and influence shaped Southern society and politics. In the South, black people lived in two very different situations. Some were free, while others were enslaved. But those who were free still faced unfair treatment. Enslaved black people had no rights at all. Most free black people were the children or grandchildren of people who had been free during or after the American Revolution. Some were even able to buy their own freedom. By 1860, more than 200,000 free black people lived in the South, mostly in places like Maryland and Delaware, where slavery was starting to fade. Others lived in big cities like New Orleans, Richmond, and Charlestown. Slave owners weren't happy about free black people living nearby. They worried that seeing free black people would make enslaved people want freedom and even more, and maybe even rebel. Plus, slave owners tried to justify slavery by saying black people couldn't take care of themselves, even those even though those same enslaved black people took care of the slave owners, their homes, their children, their livestock, and their crops. To make life harder for free black people, Southern states passed strict laws. Free black people weren't allowed to vote or even travel freely. In some places, they were told they had to leave or be forced into slavery again. Even with all these changes, free black people found ways to succeed and make important contributions. For instance, there was a man named Norbert Rillieux, Rillieaux. He invented a machine that changed the way sugar was refined, making the process way more efficient. Then you had Henry Blair, who created and patented a seed planter to help farmers. And last, well, not last, but just as a third person to put out here, there was a man named Thomas Jennings, and he invented a cleaning process that would later become what we now call dry cleaning. In 1828, he became the first black person to receive a U.S. patent. Despite not having any or very little rights, free black people still found ways to succeed and shape the world around them. Well, that's all for today. Join me next time where I will be discussing slave families, resistance, and life in the West. You guys have a good day. Bye bye.